the world on the water, and the flag that changed it. There is a particular quality to the open ocean in the early hours of morning, before the sun has fully climbed, before the heat of the day has settled over the water. The sea is silver then, almost perfectly still, and the ships that sail it move slowly, like dark thoughts crossing a quiet mind. In the final years of the 17th century, thousands of such ships were moving across the Atlantic and through the warm passages of the Caribbean. They were merchant vessels, most of them, broad-beamed, deep-hulled, riding low in the water beneath the weight of goods that had been gathered from every corner of the known world. Sugar from the islands of the West Indies, tobacco rolled tight in great barrels, cotton baled and compressed, indigo, the deep blue dye that colored the coats of European aristocracy, cacao, coffee, dried and salted fish, and beneath it all, in strong boxes bolted to the decks of the grandest ships, silver and gold, coin and ingot and worked jewelry, the hard currency of an empire stretching across two hemispheres. This was the Atlantic trade at the turn of the 18th century. It was, by any measure, the most ambitious commercial enterprise in the history of the world up to that point. The great European powers, England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Portugal, had spent nearly 200 years building the infrastructure of empire. The colonies, the ports, the sugar plantations, the slave markets, the counting houses where ledgers were kept in careful columns of profit and loss. And now, in the early 1700s, the system was humming. Ships left Bristol and Bordeaux and Amsterdam loaded with manufactured goods. They crossed the Atlantic, traded those goods for enslaved Africans in West African ports, carried those human beings across the Middle Passage to the Caribbean and the American colonies, and returned home loaded with the raw wealth that made all of it worthwhile. It was a world machine powered by suffering and organized with remarkable precision, and it moved almost entirely on water. The captains and crews of these merchant vessels were experienced men. They understood the rhythms of the ocean, the trade winds that could carry a ship from the Canaries to Barbados in 3 weeks, the doldrums near the equator where the wind died and ships could sit motionless for days, the hurricane season that made summer crossings a gamble. They carried charts and compasses and the accumulated navigational wisdom of generations. They knew this world. They were comfortable in it. What they were less comfortable with, what kept watchmen alert through long night watches, what made captains scan the horizon with something more than professional attention, was the knowledge that the ocean was not theirs alone. Piracy was not new, of course. It was, in many ways, as old as sailing itself. Wherever cargo moved by water, there had always been men willing to take it by force. The ancient Mediterranean had its pirates. The Vikings raided coastlines from Ireland to the Black Sea. In the years before the Golden Age, privateers, men sailing under government licenses called letters of marque, had prowled the trade routes with legal permission to attack enemy shipping during wartime. The line between privateer and pirate had always been thin, and it was growing thinner. When the great European wars of the late 17th century wound to a close, thousands of experienced sailors found themselves without employment, their wartime licenses revoked, their skills still sharp, and the ocean still full of unguarded wealth. By 1690, piracy in the Atlantic and Caribbean had grown from a nuisance into something that demanded serious attention. Ships were taken, crews were killed or press-ganged, cargo vanished. Insurance premiums at Lloyd's Coffee House in London, where merchants gathered to discuss maritime risk, had begun to reflect a new and uncomfortable reality. The sea was becoming dangerous in a way that charts and good seamanship could not fully account for. And then, somewhere around the year 1700, the histories are not perfectly precise, as histories of the sea rarely are. Something new appeared on the ocean, a black flag. Not the plain black flag of mourning, not the dark pennants that sometimes flew from naval vessels in times of ceremony. This was something designed, something deliberate, something that spoke with unmistakable clarity to anyone who saw it. At its center, a human skull. Below the skull, two bones arranged in a cross, white against black, bone against void, death made visible in the middle of all that blue sky and open water. The sailors who first saw it understood immediately that something had changed. This was not simply a threat. It was an announcement. It was a declaration of identity, of intent, of a whole parallel world that had organized itself outside the reach of kings and navies and merchant companies, and was now making itself known. The flag would come to be called the Jolly Roger, and in the 3 decades that followed its first sighting, it would transform the way the world thought about the ocean, about lawlessness, about freedom, and about the terrifying and strangely romantic idea of a life lived entirely outside the ordinary rules of civilization. This is the story of that flag, where it came from, what it meant, who flew it, and who feared it, how it shaped the world it sailed through, and how it has continued to shape our imagination in the 3 centuries since the last pirate who flew it in earnest was pulled from the water and hanged at the tide line. The sea is calm. The light is good. Let us begin. Or not just the shape of it, the trade routes and the island colonies and the crowded harbors, but the feeling of it, the texture of daily life for the men who sailed the Atlantic in the closing years of the 17th century, and the slow, grinding pressures that would eventually produce one of the most recognizable symbols in human history. Begin with the ships. A merchant vessel of the late 1600s was a working world unto itself. The largest of them, the great East Indiamen of the English and Dutch trading companies, were 3-masted leviathans, 150 feet long from stem to stern, carrying crews of 100 men or more. They were built for endurance rather than elegance. Their hulls were thick and rounded, designed to carry weight rather than cut speed. Below decks, the cargo holds were packed so efficiently that a good stowage officer could fit together barrels and bales and crates the way a mason fits stones. Interlocking, tight, not an inch wasted. Above decks, the rigging was a complex architecture of rope and canvas that required constant tending, constant knowledge, constant physical labor. Life aboard these ships was relentless. A sailor in the merchant trade of 1695 typically earned around 25 shillings a month, barely enough to live on, not nearly enough to save. He worked in all weather, in all temperatures, hauling on ropes in tropical heat and climbing icy rigging in North Atlantic gales. He slept in the narrow space between cargo and hull, ate salt pork and hard biscuit infested with weevils, drank water that had been stored too long in barrels that had begun to rot. He was frequently cheated by ship captains who falsified logs and withheld wages. He was subject to discipline that could, in its worst expressions, cross into outright cruelty. Flogging was legal, common, and administered at the captain's discretion for offenses as minor as insubordination or lateness. And when a voyage ended, when the ship finally came into harbor after 6 months at sea, half the crew hollow-eyed and scurvy-ravaged, the sailor was paid off and released into port towns that were designed, in many ways, to take his money back as quickly as possible. The taverns, the gambling houses, the brothels of Port Royal and Tortuga and Nassau and Bridgetown, these were not accidents. They were the service economy of empire, positioned precisely at the places where men arrived with money and left without it. This was the world that produced pirates. not through some romantic inevitability, not because the sea makes men wild and free, but because the conditions of maritime labor in the late 17th century were, by any honest measure, brutal, exploitative, and very nearly designed to radicalize the men subjected to them. Piracy, when it came, was less an adventure than a labor dispute that had escalated into violence. But it had not always been so clean a distinction. For much of the 17th century, the line between legal and illegal violence at sea was blurry to the point of meaninglessness. The instrument of that blurriness was the letter of marque. A letter of marque was a government license, a document signed and sealed by a monarch or colonial governor that authorized a private captain to attack and seize the ships of enemy nations during wartime. The men who sailed under these letters were called privateers, and they occupied a strange middle ground in the social order of the sea. They were, in effect, legal pirates, authorized raiders whose violence was sanctioned by the state as long as they restricted it to the right targets and shared a portion of their profits with the government that employed them. The system suited everyone in its way. Governments got naval muscle without having to pay for it. Ship captains got legal cover for activities that would otherwise see them hanged. And the sailors who crewed privateer vessels got better pay and a share of prizes, captured ships and their cargo, which made the work considerably more attractive than legitimate merchant service. The problem, as the 17th century drew to a close, was that the wars that had created and sustained the privateer economy began to end. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 ended the 9 Years' War between England and France. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 wrapped up the War of the Spanish Succession. With each peace, thousands of trained, experienced, and heavily armed sailors found their letters of marque revoked, their occupations suddenly reclassified from legal to criminal. They were told, in essence, that the violence they had been performing last year with government approval was now, this year, a hanging offense. Many of them went back to merchant service. Many could not, either because their reputations preceded them, or because they could not stomach a return to the brutality of ordinary sailor life after the relative freedom of the privateer world. And some of them, weighing their options carefully and finding all of the legitimate ones wanting, made a different choice entirely. They went on the account. That was the phrase used at the time, going on the account. It meant choosing piracy. It meant stepping deliberately outside the law, outside the nation, outside the entire framework of civilization that had shaped their lives up to that point. It was not a casual decision. A man who went on the account was making a wager that the freedom and potential profit of the pirate life outweighed its very considerable risks, the chief among which was that, if caught, he would be hanged by the neck at Execution Dock in Wapping until dead, and then his body would be chained in an iron cage called a gibbet and displayed at the waterline as a warning to others. The men who made this wager were, on the whole, not monsters. The historical record that survives, court depositions, newspaper accounts, the magnificent, if sometimes unreliable, work of Captain Charles Johnson in his General History of the Pirates, gives us a picture of ordinary human beings, desperate, skilled, frequently funny, sometimes kind, occasionally horrific. They had the full range of human qualities. What distinguished them from their law-abiding counterparts was not character but circumstance, and the particular calculation that circumstance had led them to. Now, all of this sets the stage, but we have not yet arrived at the flag. Before the skull and crossbones, there was another flag, and understanding it is essential to understanding why the Jolly Roger, when it appeared, was so deliberately designed and so immediately effective. The flag that preceded the Jolly Roger was red, a plain red flag, sometimes crimson, sometimes a deep arterial scarlet, flown from the mast of a pirate vessel as it closed on its prey. Among sailors of the period, this flag had a name, the Jolly Rouge. The pretty red, in French, though the name was almost certainly ironic. There was nothing pretty about what it signified. A red flag at sea, in the maritime convention of the 17th century, meant no quarter would be given. It was the signal of unconditional war, the announcement that a ship approaching under that flag would take no prisoners, accept no surrender, showed no mercy. It was a declaration of absolute violence. Pirates flew it. Naval commanders flew it in particularly uncompromising engagements. It was a recognized signal in a world where signals at sea were, by necessity, clear and unambiguous. You could not shout across the water in rough weather. You could not send a letter. Flags were the language of the sea, and they had to mean exactly what they were understood to mean. But something changed. Somewhere in the 1690s and into the early 1700s, the plain red flag began to give way to something more specific. Black replaced red as the background, and on that black field, images began to appear. The reasons for this shift are worth thinking about carefully, because they reveal something important about the nature of the pirates who made it. The plain red flag was maximally threatening, yes, but it was also maximally costly. A merchant ship that saw a red flag and understood it to mean certain death if they resisted had very little incentive to surrender at all. They might as well fight, might as well throw every gun they had at the approaching vessel, because the alternative was death regardless. The red flag, in its brutal simplicity, removed choice from the equation entirely. The black flag, the Jolly Roger, was something subtler. And subtlety, in piracy, was a commercial advantage. The first confirmed sighting of what we would recognize as a Jolly Roger comes from the year 1700. The pirate was Emmanuel Wynne, a French buccaneer operating in the Caribbean, and the flag he flew was black, bearing a skull and crossbones, and crucially, an hourglass. That hourglass mattered. It was not decoration. It was a message. As precise and deliberate as any legal document, your time is running out. Surrender now. The skull told you what was coming if you did not. The hourglass told you that the clock was ticking on your chance to avoid it. Richard Hawkins, a prisoner taken by pirates in 1724, gave one of the earliest first-hand descriptions of the flag's effect. He noted that when the black flag was raised, even experienced and well-armed crews felt something shift inside them. Not just fear, but a kind of profound disorientation, as if the rules of the known world had been suspended, and they were now operating in a space where the ordinary calculations of resistance and survival no longer applied. That disorientation, Hawkins said, was more effective than any cannon. The name. We should speak of the name because it is one of the great small mysteries of maritime history. Jolly Roger. Where does it come from? Historians have argued about this for 200 years, and the truth is that no single origin has been definitively established. There are several credible theories, and they are all interesting in different ways. The first and most widely cited theory derives the name from the French phrase Joli Rouge, the pretty red, suggesting that Jolly Roger is simply an English phonetic corruption of the name of the red flag that preceded it. As the black flag replaced the red, sailors may have carried the old name over to the new flag, the way a word sometimes outlasts the thing it originally described. A second theory points to Old Roger, a traditional English nickname for the devil. Flags of death and danger were sometimes called Roger in common speech, and it is easy enough to imagine sailors with the particular dark humor of men who live with danger professionally, adding jolly as an ironic modifier. The jolly devil, the merry death. It has the ring of gallows comedy about it. A third theory, somewhat more exotic but not without scholarly support, derives the name from Ali Raja, the Arabic and Malayalam title meaning King of the Sea, used by the powerful Malabar pirates of the Indian Ocean. English sailors who encountered these pirates during East India Company voyages may have corrupted Ali Raja into Ali Raja and then into Jolly Roger, carrying the name home to the Atlantic. And then there is the simplest theory of all, that Jolly Roger was simply a name, a nickname, given to some now forgotten individual pirate or flag, and that it spread through the maritime community by the ordinary alchemy of common speech, until it became the generic term for all such flags. We do not know. Perhaps we never will. The ocean keeps its secrets with remarkable tenacity. What we do know is that by the time Charles Johnson, who may or may not have been Daniel Defoe writing under a pseudonym, published his monumental General History of the Pirates in 1724, the Jolly Roger was already a recognized institution. Johnson catalogued the flags of the major pirates of the Golden Age with the careful attention of a naturalist describing species. Each flag was distinct, individual, the personal symbol of a particular captain and crew, as unique as a coat of arms, and yet all of them shared the same essential vocabulary: skull, bones, hourglass, weapons, the bleeding heart, the arm holding a cutlass. The grammar of the Jolly Roger was flexible, but its basic words were fixed. The flag had not simply appeared, it had evolved, slowly and deliberately, from the older traditions of maritime signaling, shaped by the particular needs and particular psychology of the men who flew it. It was a functional object before it was a symbol, and then, gradually, it became both. The golden age of piracy was entering its peak years. The flag was ready. What the flag said. To everyone who saw it, a flag is, at its most fundamental level, a communication device. It is designed to carry information across a distance too great for voice, too urgent for writing. Before the age of radio and signal lamps and satellite navigation, the flags that flew above ships were the only language available to mariners who needed to speak to one another across open water. Navies developed elaborate codebooks. Trading companies had their house colors. National flags identified allegiance and citizenship and legal status in a single, visible glance. The Jolly Roger communicated something different from all of these. It did not report a nationality or a trading affiliation. It did not ask for assistance or announce an arrival. What it did, what it was designed to do, with the precision of a surgical instrument, was initiate a negotiation, a one-sided negotiation certainly, weighted very heavily toward the party doing the flying. But a negotiation nonetheless. Here is what the black flag said, in the language of maritime convention as it had developed by the early 18th century. We are pirates. We are not affiliated with any nation or any navy that will protect you or punish us. We intend to take your cargo. If you strike your colors and surrender peacefully, we will take that cargo and leave you your ship and your lives. If you resist, if you fire on us, if you fight, we will raise the red flag, and then there will be no mercy for anyone on this vessel. That was the offer. Surrender and live. Resist and face the consequences. The skull said what the consequences were. The bones beneath it underlined a point with an economy of expression that any graphic designer would admire 3 centuries later. The genius of the flag, and it is fair to call it genius because it worked with remarkable consistency, was that it made surrender feel like the rational choice. Pirates did not generally want to fight any more than their targets did. Fighting was dangerous and expensive. Cannonballs cost money and tore holes in ships you intended to sail away in. Men got killed in battles, and men were the most valuable resource a pirate crew possessed. Violence was always a last resort for pragmatic reasons, quite apart from any ethical ones. The flag was designed to make that last resort unnecessary. For merchant captains, the calculus was similarly clear and similarly uncomfortable. A well-armed merchant vessel might successfully defend itself against a pirate attack, but the word might carry an enormous amount of weight when the alternative to success was death. More often than not, merchant captains chose survival. They struck their colors. They let the pirates board. They watched, in helpless silence, as their cargo was carefully inventoried and carried away. And then the pirates left, and the merchant sailed onto port with his life and his ship, and a story that would be told in every harbour tavern from Bridgetown to Bristol. The flag made all of this possible. Without it, piracy would have required far more violence, and far more violence would have invited far more aggressive suppression. The Jolly Roger, paradoxically, was a flag that reduced bloodshed by making the prospect of bloodshed so clear and so immediate that most people chose to avoid it. But the flag was not only a practical tool, it was also a declaration of identity, and in the hands of the great pirates of the Golden Age, it became something close to a personal signature, a work of symbolic art that communicated not just threat, but character. Consider Bartholomew Roberts, who sailed between 1719 and 1722, and who was, by any measurable standard, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age. In 3 years of operation, Roberts captured over 400 vessels, a figure so extraordinary that it strains belief until you read the painstaking work of the historians who have documented it. He ranged from the coast of Brazil to the Gulf of Guinea to the waters of Newfoundland, and everywhere he went, he flew flags of his own design. Roberts flew more than one Jolly Roger. He was, in this as in other things, a man who appreciated the specific power of the symbol. One of his flags showed a figure, widely interpreted as Roberts himself, standing on two skulls, one labelled ABH for a Barbadian's head, and the other AMH for a Martinican's head, memorializing grievances against the governors of those islands who had attempted to suppress piracy in the Caribbean. Another showed a pirate and death, a skeleton, raising a toast together, two figures drinking companionably on the edge of eternity. There is something almost literary about that image, the pirate and death, friends, equals, sharing a glass. It speaks to a particular philosophy, a conscious embrace of mortality, a refusal to pretend that life was anything other than finite and dangerous, and therefore worth living as freely as possible. Roberts himself was one of the stranger figures of the Golden Age. He dressed magnificently, silks and velvets and a red waistcoat that became legendary along the Atlantic coast, and he maintained a personal code of conduct that sat somewhat uneasily beside his considerable violence. He did not drink alcohol. He required strict discipline from his crew. He banned gambling on his ship and insisted on lights out by 8 in the evening. He was, in the words of one of his contemporaries, a man of surprisingly sober and regulated life. For a pirate, his flags reflected this. They were not crude threats, but carefully composed statements, dense with meaning, personal in a way that set them apart from the generic skull and crossbones. Then there was Edward Teach, Blackbeard. If Roberts was the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, Blackbeard was its most famous. And the gap between those two things tells you something important about how mythology works. Blackbeard operated for barely 2 years, from 1716 to 1718. He captured perhaps 50 vessels in that time, impressive by any ordinary standard, but modest compared to Roberts. Yet his name has echoed down 3 centuries, while Roberts is known primarily to enthusiasts and historians. The reason for this is, in large part, the performance. Blackbeard understood something that Roberts perhaps understood less intuitively, that in the pirate business, reputation was capital. A crew that made an enemy crew so frightened they surrendered without firing a single shot had, effectively, won without spending anything at all. And fear could be manufactured. Fear could be designed and maintained and amplified deliberately, the way a skilled actor amplifies a role through costume and movement and timing. Edward Teach designed himself as a monster. He was a tall man with an extraordinary beard, jet black and extraordinarily full. which he wore braided into long ropes and tied with colored ribbons. Before going into battle, he reportedly wove slow-burning fuses, hemp cords soaked in saltpeter and lime water, into that beard and lit them, so that as his ship bore down on its prey, its captain appeared to be wreathed in smoke and fire, a devil emerging from his own private hell. Whether this story is literally true or somewhat embellished by the time it reached the printing press is almost beside the point. What matters is that it was told, believed, and repeated. The image became real in its effects, regardless of its origins. His flag reflected this self-created mythology, where many Jolly Rogers were relatively spare, skull and bones, perhaps an hourglass. Blackbeard's flag depicted a full-figured skeleton, horned like a devil, holding in one hand a spear aimed at a bleeding heart, and in the other a raised glass, as if in a toast. It was elaborate, dramatic, and deliberately designed to confirm everything that sailors already feared about him. When that flag went up, it carried with it the accumulated weight of every story that had been told about Blackbeard in every harbor, from the Chesapeake to Havana. The flag was not just a threat, it was a reminder. Calico Jack, John Rackham, gave us perhaps the most visually enduring Jolly Roger of all. His flag was simpler than Blackbeard's or Robert's, a skull above two crossed cutlasses, without the hourglass or the elaborate allegorical figures. It was graphic and immediate, and perfectly balanced. A design so cleanly composed that it has survived essentially intact into the 21st century. When children draw a pirate flag, they generally draw something close to Calico Jack's. The crossed swords rather than bones is believed to have been his personal innovation, a distinction that set his flag apart from the more common skull and crossbones while maintaining the essential vocabulary of the form. Calico Jack is notable for another reason too. His crew included Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who sailed as pirates at a time when women aboard ship were considered, by many sailors, to be bad luck. Their stories are extraordinary, and the Jolly Roger that flew over their shared vessel deserves to be seen in the context of who was beneath it. A pirate crew that included women who fought as hard as any man aboard, who were, according to at least one historical account, more fiercely resistant during the taking of their ship than most of the male crew. The flag made no distinctions of gender. Under the Jolly Roger, you were a pirate or you were not. This brings us to perhaps the most overlooked but historically important aspect of the Jolly Roger, what it meant internally to the pirates who sailed beneath it. Quite apart from what it communicated to their targets, the flag was a declaration of solidarity, a commitment. When a man or woman joined a pirate crew and agreed to sail under the Jolly Roger, they were signing up not just for the potential profit, but for a whole alternative social contract. Pirates of the Golden Age operated under what were called articles, written agreements signed by every crew member that established the rules of life aboard the ship. These articles varied from crew to crew, but they shared certain consistent features that, read from a distance of 300 years, are startling in their progressiveness. Compensation for injuries was specified and guaranteed. A man who lost his right arm in battle received a fixed payment from the common fund. Decision-making was democratic to a degree that no merchant vessel or naval ship could approach. The crew voted on major decisions, including where to sail and whether to take a prize. Profits were divided according to a specified formula, with the captain receiving a larger share but not the overwhelming proportion that a merchant captain or naval officer would have commanded. There were rules against cheating your fellow crew members, rules about acceptable levels of violence, rules about the treatment of prisoners. The Jolly Roger, flying above a ship that operated under these articles, was the outward sign of this inward compact. It said, "We have made our own world here. We have our own laws, our own economy, our own justice. The world you came from, with its hierarchies and its wage theft and its floggings and its kings, that world ends at the waterline of this ship. Here, We have built something different. Merchants who were captured and brought aboard pirate ships sometimes reported their astonishment at what they found. Not the chaos they had expected, not the random brutality of the stories, but something closer to an ordered community, strange in its customs, but coherent in its logic. Men from a dozen nations, English, French, Dutch, African, Caribbean, Portuguese, sailing together under a flag that belonged to no nation, and therefore to all of them equally. This was what the Jolly Roger meant from the inside. A community organized around the rejection of the world that had failed its members, and the construction, however imperfect and however violent at its edges, of something they could call their own. The merchants feared it, the navies hunted it, the newspapers printed lurid accounts of the horrors committed beneath it, and all of those responses, paradoxically, only deepened the flag's power. Because every story told about it, however frightening, was also an acknowledgement that the men who flew it had succeeded in making themselves impossible to ignore. The long shadow, what the flag left behind. Every age ends. Every golden thing tarnishes eventually, and the golden age of piracy was no exception. By the early 720s, the forces of empire had begun to organize themselves against the men who flew the Jolly Roger, with a seriousness and a coordination that would prove, in the end, decisive. The change began not with any single battle or any grand strategic decision, but with a slow accumulation of political will. The Atlantic trade that had grown so enormously in the first 2 decades of the 18th century was now generating enough wealth and losing enough of it to piracy, that the merchant classes of England and France and the Netherlands were exerting real pressure on their governments to do something about it. The numbers were stark. Lloyd's of London estimated that piracy was costing English merchants millions of pounds annually. Ships were being lost at a rate that made certain trade routes economically marginal. Something had to change. What changed was the law. The Piracy Act of 1717 and its successor legislation created a new legal framework for dealing with pirates, one that was specifically designed to remove some of the procedural obstacles that had made prosecutions difficult. Vice Admiralty courts in the colonies were given expanded jurisdiction. Governors were given new powers and new incentives to cooperate in suppression campaigns. Royal pardons were offered to pirates who turned themselves in and gave up their life, and a surprising number of men took those pardons, calculating that the odds had shifted and that a second chance at a legitimate life was worth taking. Those who did not take the pardons faced an increasingly well-organized naval response. The Royal Navy, at peace after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, had a surplus of warships and experienced crews. It began deploying them specifically against pirate strongholds, particularly Nassau in the Bahamas, which had become, by around 1715, effectively a pirate republic, home to perhaps 2,000 men living under their own articles and flying their own flags with complete disregard for any national authority. The man sent to clean up Nassau was Woodes Rogers, a former privateer himself, which gave him a particular insight into the minds of the men he was dealing with. Rogers arrived in 1718 with 4 warships, a garrison of soldiers, and a clear mandate: bring order to the Bahamas. He offered the pardon to those who would accept it and hanged those who would not. And within a few weeks of his arrival, the pirate Republic of Nassau had ceased to exist in any meaningful form. Some men scattered to the coast of West Africa, to the Indian Ocean, to the more remote corners of the Caribbean. Some took the pardon and attempted to resume ordinary lives. Some were hanged. The year 1708 was pivotal in other ways. It was the year Blackbeard died. In November of that year, a Royal Navy sloop under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard cornered Blackbeard's vessel, the Adventure, in the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet off the coast of North Carolina. The battle that followed was brief and brutal. Blackbeard and a reduced crew of around 20 men fought with the desperate ferocity of men who knew they were not going to see another sunrise. And they inflicted serious casualties on Maynard's crew, but they were outgunned and surrounded. Blackbeard himself was shot 5 times and slashed by a sword more than 20 times, according to contemporary accounts, before he finally fell. Maynard cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop as he sailed back to port. It was a deliberate symbolic act, and it worked on the level of symbolism as intended. The most feared name in the Atlantic, the man whose horned devil flag had caused hundreds of merchant captains to surrender without a fight, was dead. Physically, specifically, undeniably dead. His head swinging from a naval bowsprit was the government's answer to the Jolly Roger, a counter-symbol, a demonstration that the world on the other side of the flag could reach the men behind it. Bartholomew Roberts died 4 years later, in February 1722, in a battle off the coast of West Africa. He was killed early in the engagement, a grape shot to the throat, according to the most reliable accounts, before the fight had properly begun. His crew, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered quickly. Over 200 of them were brought to trial at Cape Corso Castle in Ghana, in what remains one of the largest piracy trials in history. 52 were hanged, the rest were imprisoned or transported. With Roberts gone, the Golden Age effectively ended. There were still pirates after 1722. There have always been pirates in one form or another, and there are pirates today operating from the coasts of Somalia and the Strait of Malacca. But the specific era of the Jolly Roger, the 3 decades when the black flag was flown openly in the Atlantic by large and organized crews who had built an alternative civilization on the water, that era was over. The flags were furled. The ships were captured, burned, or absorbed into legitimate fleets. The men who had sailed beneath the skull and crossbones were hanged in public, their bodies gibbeted at the waterline as a warning, or they disappeared into the anonymity of civilian life. The world they had built, imperfect, violent, sometimes extraordinary, dissolved back into the ocean that had held it. And yet, the Jolly Roger did not disappear. It did something far more interesting than disappear. It transformed. It moved from the mast to the page, from the open sea to the imagination. And in doing so, it achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of naval suppression could have prevented. The crucial vehicle for this transformation was Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates, published in London in 1724, just as the last of the great pirates were being hanged. The book was a sensation. It went through multiple editions in the first year of its publication. It was read by everyone, by the merchant classes who had feared piracy, by the working men who had harbored secret admiration for it, by the writers and artists who would carry its imagery forward for the next 3 centuries. Johnson wrote with a novelist's eye for detail and a sensationalist's instinct for what made a good story. His portraits of Blackbeard, Roberts, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and dozens of other pirates were vivid and specific and human in ways that the dry language of court records rarely managed. He made these people real, and, crucially, he described the flags. Johnson's descriptions of the Jolly Rogers of the Golden Age, with their skulls and hourglasses and dancing skeletons and bleeding hearts, fixed those images in the literary imagination of the English-speaking world. Every subsequent pirate story drew from his reservoir of detail, whether its authors knew it or not. When Robert Louis Stevenson sat down in the early 1880s to write Treasure Island, the novel that more than any other single work defined the popular image of piracy, he was drawing on a tradition that stretched back directly to Johnson's book, which he had read and absorbed. Treasure Island was published in 1883, first serialized in a children's magazine, and then as a novel. Its impact on the mythology of piracy is almost impossible to overstate. Stevenson gave us Long John Silver, the most influential fictional pirate in the English language. Not a monster, but a man, charming, intelligent, morally flexible, dangerous, and somehow, despite everything, likable. He gave us Treasure Island itself, and the map with the X that marks the spot. He gave us the black spot, that ominous pirate calling card that has no real historical basis but feels as if it should. And he gave us, at the center of all of it, the Jolly Roger. Not the specific flag of any historical pirate, but the symbol in its pure, distilled, universally recognizable form. The success of Treasure Island created a template that has been followed, in one form or another, by every pirate story since. J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan 1904 gave us Captain Hook, whose name alone tells you something about the literary debt he owes to the tradition. A one-handed villain presiding over a ship of lost men, flying the skull and crossbones above the lagoons of Neverland. The 20th century brought pirate films, pirate cartoons, pirate theme park rides, pirate Halloween costumes, pirate-themed birthday parties. The Jolly Roger appeared on the tails of the early aircraft of the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm. It was adopted by military units around the world as a symbol of daring and unorthodox thinking. Poison bottles were marked with the skull and crossbones as a warning. Pirate radio stations flew the flag, metaphorically and sometimes literally, as a declaration of their operation outside the official broadcasting establishment. In each of these contexts, the flag carried a consistent core of meaning that traced back directly to the men who first flew it in the waters of the Caribbean and the Atlantic. It meant, we are outside the rules. We operate by our own code. We are dangerous, but we are also, in some complicated way, free. That combination, danger and freedom, lawlessness and an alternative kind of order, is what has given the Jolly Roger its extraordinary staying power. It speaks to something in the human imagination that is not particular to any era or any culture, the desire to step outside the ordinary world, and its frustrations and its hierarchies and its small indignities, the fantasy of a life lived on one's own terms, on the open sea, accountable to no one but one's shipmates and one's own conscience. That desire has never gone away, because the conditions that produced it, the unfairness of ordinary life, the weight of systems that grind down individuals for the benefit of larger interests, have never gone away either. The historical reality of the Jolly Roger was, of course, considerably more complicated than any of these romantic readings allow. The pirates who flew it were not heroes on the whole. They committed genuine violence. They terrorized innocent sailors. They participated, many of them, in the slave trade they had nominally escaped, taking enslaved people as prizes, sometimes keeping them as crew members, more often selling them back into bondage. The freedom they declared was real, but it was purchased at a considerable cost, borne by people who had no say in the matter. These complications are part of the story, too, part of why the Jolly Roger is such a rich and contested symbol. It has meant different things to different people in different centuries. Genuine terror, romantic adventure, countercultural rebellion, military daring, commercial branding. It has been co-opted and commodified and stripped of much of its original meaning, and yet it retains, for those who look at it carefully, the trace of something that was real and specific and historically significant. The men and women who sailed beneath it were real. Their lives were hard, and their choices were constrained, and they made the calculations that their circumstances led them to. They built, briefly and imperfectly, a world according to their own principles on the open ocean, a world that no church or government or trading company had sanctioned, a world that flew its own flag precisely because it belonged to no existing nation. That flag outlived them all. It has outlived the empires that hunted them down. It has outlived the ships and the trade routes and the colonial systems that gave the golden age of piracy its context and its cause. It flies today on novelty products and military aircraft, and the masts of recreational sailboats whose owners are, in all likelihood, perfectly law-abiding people who simply like the look of it. And perhaps that is the final thing worth saying about the Jolly Roger. Symbols that survive centuries do so because they touch something that does not change. The specific history fades, the particular grievances become academic. The names of the men and women who flew the flag recede into the comfortable distance of the past. But the skull remains, the bones remain, the black field snapping in the ocean wind, and somewhere underneath it, somewhere in the part of us that responds to the image before the rational mind has time to consider it, something stirs, something that remembers, or imagines it remembers, what it felt like to sail free. The sea is wide. The horizon is always ahead of you. And if you look carefully at the edge of it, just to the point where the water meets the sky, you might, if the light is right, still catch the ghost of a black flag, still moving, still flying, still telling its old and complicated story to anyone willing to listen.